Hello again, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about positive slope. Remember that there are four different kinds of slope: positive slope, zero slope, which is also known as no slope, negative slope, and undefined slope. So what we're going to do is we are going to look at positive slope, which is what we have on our graph down below, and we're going to look at how do we write an equation that matches this line. Okay, so we're going to look at this line, which is a positive sloped line, and we're going to write an equation for that line. So one of the things that we need to remember is, first, we have to remember what the form of the equation is for a line. And if you'll remember, the equation of a line is always written as y equals mx plus b. So there we have our equation. And let's see if we can remember what the different parts of this equation are. So the first part, and if you want to pause it and quiz yourself, you can go ahead and do that. The first part of the equation that we're going to look at is the m. Okay, so let's all remind ourselves what m is equal to. M is equal to slope. Okay, the slope of the line. Now that doesn't only mean positive or negative or undefined. It also means what is the change in y over the change in x. So let's write that in. Change in y over the change in x. Okay, so that's what our slope is. And the next part of the equation that we're going to look at is the b. And hopefully you guys can remember that b is really the y-intercept. And the y-intercept, if you remember, is where the line crosses the y-axis. So let's look at this particular graph that we have, and let's write an equation that matches the form that we're looking for. So when we do this, one of the things that you guys are going to learn really quickly is that it's always easier to start with the y-intercept. And the way that you can kind of remember that is y-intercept is the variable b, and you can think of that as the beginning of your equation, or the beginning point of your graph. So let's find that. Let's see. The y-intercept is where this line that we have on our graph, where this line right here, where it crosses the y-axis. Okay, so here's our y-axis, here's our line, and as you can see right there, it crosses the y-axis at the value of positive 5. So our y-intercept, where the line crosses the y-axis, our y-intercept is positive 5. So I can use that as my variable b and say that b is positive 5. The next part of the equation is the slope. So I know we went over this very, very quickly, so I'm going to go into it a little bit more in depth this time. Remember that when we're talking about slope, we're talking about the change in y as the first part. So when we talk about change in y, what that means is how far did we move on the y-axis, meaning how far up and down do we go when we go from one point to the next. Now obviously, in order to do this, the first thing we have to do is we have to have two different points. So what you do is when you're looking for two different points to use, the best way to do it is to find where the line on the equation, or the line on the graph, this line right here, where it crosses two different coordinates for two different points. Okay, so let's just pick a couple. So one of them could be this point right here. Now if you look at that, you guys should be able to do this. We've been doing this for many years. The coordinates of that point are negative 4, that's our x value, and then our y value is positive 3. So we have the coordinate negative 4 and 3. That's one of the points that we can use. Now to make this first one easier on us, we are going to pick the very next point on the line that also crosses at a perfect set of coordinates, which would be right here. And that point is going to be at negative 2 and positive 4 as the 2 points for that the two coordinates for that point. So there we have our two different points. Now, the change in y, when we talk about change in y, what we're really talking about is if we were to read from left to right and go from one point to the next, so here we have our first point here, and we're going to move to our second point here. How far up do we have to move to get to the same level as this second point? Now hopefully you guys can see that this one's pretty obvious, but we're going to move exactly one line up, one space up. So that's our change in y. It's how far up did we move for the change in y. So if we're going to use this, let's go over here and we're just going to write this down, that m is the change in y, and in this case our change in y was a positive 1. That's the movement that we made. Okay, so we can write that in over here on our graph as well. So that's the first part. The second part is the change in x, meaning how far did we move on the x-axis, or how far sideways did we move? So if we look at this point again, we can see that picking up from where we left off with our y movement, from there we moved 2 spaces to the right. Okay? Now this 2 spaces to the right is a movement of positive 2, and we're going to write that into our value for slope really quickly, and then I'll explain it. When you move from left to right on a number line, okay, because really that's what the x-axis is, it's just a number line. If we move from left to right, we're always adding value to whatever we started with. So for example, if we were to just look at the number line part, we started at this value of -4. That's where our first point was. Our second point was at -2. And if we move to the right 2 spaces, we are adding 2 to -4. -4 plus 2 is -2. So we've added 2, and that's another way that we can think of this -2 in our fraction for slope, is that we've added the value of 2 to the first value that we had for x. So we now have the two different parts, and you should from this point be able to write an equation using those two different parts because we've done this in the past. So let's go through this and write our actual equation out that we just figured out. So our value for this equation would have to be that y equals, and instead of an m, we're going to substitute in 1 over 2, positive 1 over positive 2, which is just 1/2. Y equals 1/2 x, and then we put in the last part, which is the b, and in this case we already found that that's positive 5. So we have y equals 1/2 x plus 5. And that's how we find a positive slope if we are given a graph and we have to write the equation for that graph. Hope that helps, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.